Part 3, Chapter 4. To make matters worse, the problem of food, especially blubber for cooking, was again approaching the critical point. It was 3 weeks since they had killed a seal, and the meager store of blubber from the Adelies was almost gone. Their stock of provisions from the ship was almost nearly exhausted. On March 16th, the last of their flour was used up. It was made into dog pemmican, bannocks, and several men nipped and nibbled at their 1-ounce portions for more than an hour. Inevitably, the old resentments against Shackleton's refusal to get in all possible game when it was available cropped up. Even Macklin, who had refrained from all criticism of Shackleton's policy in the past, felt so strongly that he devised a code so he could not comment on the subject in his diary without fearing that his thoughts would be read by others. On the 17th, he wrote in code, "I think the boss was a bit improvident in not getting in all the food possible whilst the going was good. It was worth the risk." Then on the 18th, Lease tackled the boss a few days ago about getting in all food possible from Ocean Camp, in the event of having to winter on the floe. Boss rather snapped at him, saying it will do some of these people good to go hungry. Their bloody appetites are too big. As the days went by, their rations had to be steadily decreased. The tea and coffee now were finished, and because of the shortage of blubber for fuel to melt ice into water, they were allowed only 1 ration of very diluted powdered milk a day. It was served at breakfast, along with 5 ounces of seal steak. Lunch was cold, a quarter can be of frozen broth, and 1 canned biscuit. Supper consisted of a serving of a seal or penguin hoosh. Most of the men felt the shortage of food almost as physical pain, the compulsive craving of their bodies for more fuel to burn to ward off the cold, causing a gnawing, ceaseless hunger. And the weather was becoming increasingly bitter, with nighttime temperatures frequently dropping as low as 10 below. Thus, when their need for calories was greatest, they were forced to get along less than ever. Many men found that a few hours after eating, they had to crawl into their sleeping bags to keep from shivering until the next meal put some warmth back into them. There were some intrepid attempts to make jokes about cannibalism. Greenstreet and I, wrote Worsley, amuse ourselves at Marston's expense. Marston is the plumpest man in the camp, and we had become very solicitous about his welfare and condition, making a great show of generosity by offering him old penguin bones that we had gnawed till there is nothing left. We implore him not to get thin and even go as far as to select chops, etc., off him and quarrel about who shall have the tenderest part. Finally, he gets so disgusted with us that whenever he sees us approaching him, he turns and walks away. It was a poor attempt at humor, because there was an element of pertinence in the subject matter, and Worsley himself, apart from these painful efforts to be funny, had grown silent and morose. By March 22nd, the food situation was so critical that Shackleton told Macklin that his dogs would have to be shot the next day so that the party might eat the food set aside for the dogs. Macklin reacted indifferently. "I must confess that I cannot see that they will be of much more use to us. Ocean Camp has apparently disappeared. We have now only 10 more days blubber fuel. It is to be hoped that we can get more seals, or we shall be in a bad way indeed." The morning of March 23rd dawned cold, with a patchy fog lying across the pack. Shackleton was up early to take a constitutional. He walked to the edge of the floe, and when the fog cleared for a moment, he saw a black object far in the distance to the southwest. He watched it for a few minutes, then hurried back to his tent and roused Hurley. The 2 men returned to the edge of the floe and peered for several minutes through the intermittent bands of fog. It was there all right, and it was land. Shackleton immediately ran back to camp, going from tent to tent shouting, "Land in sight! Land in sight!" The reaction was strange. Some men bounded out of their tents to see for themselves, but others, cold and discouraged, and tired of mistaking distant bergs for land, refused to stir from their sleeping bags, at least until the sighting had been confirmed. But this was not a distant berg or a mirage. It was one of the tiny danger islets, identifiable, according to the British Antarctic sailing directions, by its tabletop bluffs rising steeply out of the water. It lay exactly 42 miles away. Only 20 miles beyond it lay what had been their destination, Paulet Island. The men stood looking at the land for a short time until the thickening fog cut off their view. Early in the afternoon, however, the weather cleared beautifully, revealing in the distance beyond the danger islets the black base of a range of mountains. Is it islets? Their peaks hidden in low-lying clouds. Worsley identified the tallest of the peaks as Mount Percy on Joinville Island, off the very tip of the Palmer Peninsula. The island lay just 57 miles, very nearly due west of them, almost exactly at right angles to the direction of their drift. If the ice opens, we could land in a day, wrote Hurley. But there wasn't a man among them who believed that the pack would open. Quite the contrary. There were fully 70 bergs in sight, many of them aground, and they seemed for the moment to be preventing the pack from either opening or drifting much to the north. If the boats had been launched, they would probably have been crushed within minutes. Furthermore, sledging across the ice was unthinkable. The pack was now a dense mass of broken bits of floes, 1,000 times more treacherous than 3 months before when they had struggled for 5 days and covered 9 miles from Ocean Camp. Consequently, the sight of land was but another reminder of their helplessness. Greenstreet's attitude was rather typically cynical. It is nice to think there is something else besides snow and ice in the world, but I fail to see any cause for excitement, as it puts us no nearer getting out. What I would far rather see would be a crowd of seals coming up, so that we might get food and fuel. Yet frustrating as it was, the sight of land was welcome, as James noted, if for no other reason than it is nearly 16 months since we last saw any black rock. Macklin especially benefited since, in the excitement, Shackleton apparently forgot his decision to have Mackleton's team killed. "Please God," wrote Shackleton that night, "we will soon get ashore." But there was precious little land left on which to get ashore. They had drifted to the absolute tip of the Palmer Peninsula, and reaching land now seemed all but impossible. Thus, between them and the open seas and Cape Horn rollers of the dreaded Drake Passage, the most storm-torn ocean on the globe, all that remained were 2 lonely, sentinel-like outposts of the Antarctic continent, Clarence and Elephant Islands, about 120 miles to the north. Beyond these, there was nothing. March 24th was a bright, sunshiny day, and the peaks of Joinville Island were clearly visible. James, looking across the dense, impassable pack, could not help but remark, "It is quite maddening to think that one little rift 20 feet wide or so would lead us out in a couple of days, and all the time everything keeps as close as ever, making a move of any sort an impossibility. We are all very silent and absorbed in the tent, and don't get much conversation. There is an air of expectancy about which causes much preoccupation." The air of expectancy was heightened late in the day when 2 cracks developed in their floe, only about 90 feet from the boats. Fortunately, they did not open. Just after dawn the following morning, a sudden violent gale sprang up from the southwest, but it lasted only until mid-afternoon, and then the wind died off quickly and the weather cleared. The sunset was stormy looking, with fiery shreds of cloud passing across the face of the sun. Joinville Island once more came into view astern, though it was distant and indistinct. The biting cold brought by the southerly gale continued into the night, and they all suffered bitterly. Their bodies seemed to lack even enough heat to warm their sleeping bags. Less than a week's supply of blubber remained, so on March 26th, the 5-ounce ration of seal steaks at breakfast was cut out. In its place, the men were usually given a half-pound cake of cold dog pemmican and a half ration of powdered milk. On very cold days, a few lumps of sugar were added. Lunch was 1 biscuit and 3 lumps of sugar, and supper, the only so-called hot meal of the day, consisted of seal or penguin hoosh, cooked for the minimum possible time. No water was issued at any time. If a man wanted a drink, he packed snow into a small can, usually a tobacco tin, and held it against his body to melt, or slept with it in his sleeping bag. But a full tobacco tin of snow yielded only a tablespoonful or 2 of water. Word reached Shackleton on the 26th that several men had taken bits of blubber and penguin meat from the general store and were trying to eat it, frozen and raw. Shackleton immediately ordered that their remaining supply of stores be placed directly outside his tent. In addition, Macklin was told to pick out anything fit for human consumption from the stock of waste meat used to feed the dogs. Macklin sorted it out, setting aside everything except that which was too stinking to contemplate eating. It was a repulsive collection of odd bits of flesh, Shackleton noted, and unfortunately, if we do not get more seals, we will have to eat it raw. It appeared, too, that the dogs would have to be eaten soon. They had been spared thus far because there was still a bare chance of making one last trip to Ocean Camp for the stores there. After that was done, or if it became evident that it could not be done, the dogs were to be shot and eaten. I would have no hesitation in eating dog cooked, wrote Macklin, but I do not look forward to eating it raw. For days, several men had strongly urged Shackleton to risk this one desperate dash back to Ocean Camp, now barely visible about 7 miles away. A 600 or 700 pound store of dog pemmican and about 60 pounds of flour still remained there. But Shackleton, though he was gravely concerned about the state of their supplies, could not bring himself to send their dog drivers across ice, which was so obviously treacherous. Almost continually, there were sounds of pressure, apparently caused by the ice being jammed against the curving arm of the Palmer Peninsula. The noise echoed through the ice and movement could be seen in almost every direction. "I hope our old packet isn't going to break up," Greenstreet commented, "as there isn't another decent floe anywhere to be seen." The numerous bergs in the vicinity were also hastening the general disintegration of the ice. With their deep draft, the bergs seemed to be affected by erratic tidal currents. Periodically, one would cease to travel peacefully along with the rest of the pack and would suddenly veer off on its own, grinding through the ice and effortlessly shouldering aside anything in its path, leaving a wake of broken and upended floes. And there was no predicting what course these drunken juggernauts would take. On March 27th, Worsley noted that one huge berg unaccountably drew away from the northeast, and a berg from the north came charging down towards our floe, 5 miles in 4 hours, but luckily passed just clear to the east. The trip to Ocean Camp seemed to be growing less feasible by the hour, and Shackleton knew that it was now or never. Reluctantly, he told Macklin that night to be prepared for a possible start early the next morning. Macklin had already turned in, but he was so delighted at the news that he got up and worked for some time, readying the harness and getting his sledge into shape. But at dawn, the ice was very much on the move, and a heavy mist had rolled in. Shackleton came to number 5 tent just at breakfast time to inform Macklin that he had decided against the trip. It was a crushing disappointment, coming as it did on the heels of a miserable night of wet, misty weather, during which nobody had slept much. And I just lost my page here. Shackleton had hardly left when Macklin turned on Clark for some feeble reason, and the two men were almost immediately shouting at one another. The tension spread to Ordley's and Worsley and triggered a blasphemous exchange between them. In the midst of it, Greenstreet upset his powdered milk. He whirled on Clark, cursing him for causing the accident because Clark had called his attention for a moment. Clark tried to protest, but Greenstreet shouted him down. Then Greenstreet paused to get his breath, and in that instant his anger was spent, and he suddenly fell silent. Everyone else in the tent became quiet too, and looked at Greenstreet, shaggy-haired, bearded, and filthy with blubber soot, holding his empty mug in his hand and looking helplessly down into the snow that had thirstily soaked up his precious milk. The loss was so tragic he seemed almost on the point of weeping. Without speaking, Clark reached out and poured some of his milk into Greenstreet's mug. Then Worsley, then Macklin, and Rickinson, and Kerr, Ordley's, and finally Blackborough. They finished in silence. Just after breakfast, 2 seals were sighted and hunting parties were urgently organized. The first group secured the closer of the 2, and the others were within a short distance of their quarry when Shackleton, feeling that the ice was too dangerous, summoned them back to camp. On the way back, Ordley's collapsed from hunger. As usual, he had eaten only half his breakfast ration, 1/8 of a pound of cold dog pemmican, and 1.5 lumps of sugar, intending to save the rest for later. After several minutes' rest, however, he was able to regain his feet and make his way back to camp. Later in the day, the misty weather turned into pure rain, with the temperature rising to 33 degrees. Most of the men crawled into their sleeping bags and stayed there while the rain continued. That night, and all the next day, Macklin described it. A stream of water collected and, running under my bag, soaked it completely through, the bottom being absolutely sodden, and mitts, socks, and other gear got thoroughly soaked too. Even as I sit and write this, the water is dripping from the tent roof, and every receptacle, empty tins, etc., are in use to prevent our bags from getting wetter. We are only partially successful, for the drips are coming in through 4 times as many places as we had receptacles for. I have spread my Burberrys over my bag, and when a pool has collected in them, big enough, I carefully lift and pour it into the snow at one side. It is pretty tedious having thus to keep a constant vigilance. I pray God to send us dry weather soon, for this is misery. I've never seen such depression of spirits as there is in the tent today. Later in the afternoon, the rain changed to snow, and by 5 o'clock it had ceased altogether. James was night watchman that evening from 9 to 10, and as he was walking around the floe, he thought he detected a movement in the ice. Looking closely, he saw a very distinct swell, slowly lifting the floe. He reported his discovery to Shackleton, who gave orders that the watchman should be especially alert. At 5:20 the next morning, the floe split.